Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the History Archive by Noah.beier. This is a history podcast where I talk about all sorts of themes related to recent history and how they formed our current world. In the last episode, we talked about the early days of military aviation and aviation in general. I took a little sidestep into that area as well in the last episode. And if you want to get the contents of this episode more clearly, then I would recommend going back and listening to that previous episode in its entirety. So today we will be exploring the age of the nuclear bomber, especially, of course, in the context of the Cold War. Of course, the first two ever nuclear bombs were already dropped via a bomber, being a B-29. These bombs were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. As a result, the Japanese forces surrendered to the Allied forces, and World War II was officially over, especially worldwide, as now all the Axis powers had surrendered. Nazi Germany, of course, had already surrendered a little earlier in 1945, and the Italians, of course, had already surrendered in the years leading up to 1945, where these events took place and Japan was bombed with Little Boy and Fat Man. That were the names of the two nuclear bombs dropped on those respective cities. The Americans had been able to develop their first atomic bomb in the Manhattan Project, made a little famous in our pop culture currently with the movie Oppenheimer by Christopher Nolan, which revolves around the developer of the nuclear bomb in Robert J. Oppenheimer. This project managed to create the first ever nuclear weapon. However, the project was infiltrated by Soviet spies. People like Klaus Fuchs and David Greenglass had taken insider information out of the labs at Los Alamos and other various labs involved in the Manhattan Project, and this made it possible for the Soviets to accelerate their own nuclear program. In fact, their spies made it possible to carry the entire process basically in just 4 years. However, if you are going to have a nuclear bomb, then you are going to have some sort of way of transporting this nuclear bomb. So before missile and rocket technology allowed the construction of so-called intercontinental ballistic missiles, or short ICBMs, that could hit any target in the world from anywhere on the world, long-range bombers were the weapon of choice when it came to delivering potential nuclear strikes, as we already saw during the Japan bombings. Today, the US and other countries as well employ the so-called nuclear triad to maintain its nuclear deterrent of attacks on their own soil, with the logic that if I'm hit with a nuclear strike, I can respond accordingly. So how does this nuclear triad work? What does it look like? Well, the triad, as a tree might suggest, means the thing has 3 legs. The legs are the sea, the air, and the land areas. Sea, I talked about in the episode Underwater Warfare Part 2. It basically consists mainly of nuclear submarines that wait under the waves and can launch ICBMs from wherever they are to attack enemy grounds. The air part is made up of long-range nuclear bombers, these days usually as well with stealth capabilities like the B-2 Spirit, and the land leg is made up of ICBMs as well. However, these are stowed in missile silos in mostly the Middle West of America. Biggest problem with these is currently that most of the equipment is absolutely ancient, being installed there partly in the 1960s, and this equipment has to upkeep the operations in these bunkers all the time. So historically speaking, why do we need 2 extra legs if we have a functioning system in the bomber? The bomber, as I explained in the last episode on this show, already existed. They existed partly already in World War I, and then took full-on scale in World War II, as you can very well see in the London Blitz, where German bombers dropped bombs en masse in British citizens, like especially in London or Coventry, as you might know. Aircraft, of course, have the advantage, as I just already emphasized slightly, that they are simple and were already there. And they had already been brought up to a relatively high technological standard by the 50s, or by the late 40s. So you already had functioning systems, as you can see during the Japan attacks. The B-29 only had to be slightly modified to carry a nuclear weapon. Another factor that speaks for just remaining with the nuclear bomber is that it is reusable, in contrast to a nuclear missile, of course, that can only be used once because it goes down together with the payload it is carrying. And probably most importantly, long-range bombers, as the name might suggest, have a very far range, and they can basically travel to almost anywhere on the globe with their nuclear payload. This is, of course, especially important until the late 1960s, at which point rocket and missile technology had advanced to a point where it was feasible to build a rocket that could hit any target on the world from anywhere. Developments in this direction were already starting in the early 60s, but at that point these missiles were still very high maintenance and it was still a relatively shaky technology. They needed a lot of attention and were very difficult, and it took a long preparation span to get them ready, which of course makes them relatively unsuitable for a counter-strike. So this is one of the reasons, by the way, why the US installed their intermediate range missiles in Turkey. Because Turkey, as you will probably know if you look at a map of Europe, is adjacent to the Soviet Union, or what was once the Soviet Union and is today Russia. So as not to be dependent on missiles stationed in Turkey, which the US would have to remove in course of the Cuban Missile Crisis, they had installed the Chrome Dome in the 50s. It is basically a system where you always have a bomber armed with nuclear weapons in the air, flying usually rounds over Europe, and if the president gives the word, they would enter Soviet airspace and drop their deadly payload on whatever target is desired. So this managed to circumvent the problem of not having a long-range missile that could fly from the US to the Soviet Union yet. So now I listed a few positives of having nuclear bombers and why at first they were basically the only way, and later than the primary way, to deliver a nuclear strike. But why were they then more or less replaced by different weapon systems? Well, as so often in history and engineering, if something comes along that does the job better, then the old thing is replaced. I think I talked about this at least a little in the railway episode, and there will be an upcoming episode where we'll talk about this as well. So, what are those glaring disadvantages to having nuclear bombers? And don't take me wrong, nuclear bombers are still around today, as I mentioned earlier, but why are there now other systems in place as well, which carry a larger responsibility for the nuclear deterrent role? Well, at first and foremost, bombers are not safe. Now this may sound a little silly, because all nuclear bombs are kind of unsafe, and there have been accidents with all three legs of the triad over the course of the years, and thank goodness there have not been any really devastatingly serious events, but there were some that came quite close. And the most dangerous event that ever occurred, also these events are usually codenamed as broken arrows. The US government specify these as, quote, "A broken arrow is defined as an unexpected event involving nuclear weapons that result in the accidental launching, firing, detonation, theft, or loss of the weapon." So, this is a quote from the US government that I just read aloud for you. That gives you the definition of a broken arrow, and I will be referring to these incidents as broken arrows. So the most serious broken arrow incident happened over the Mediterranean. It happened in January of 1966. So, as a rule of thumb, the 60s was a time where the Cold War was still pretty hot and spicy. Together with the 80s, I would say the two decades with the most potential for a nuclear escalation, but I think the 60s, especially of course the years 1961 and 62, of course had pretty massive potential for having a nuclear war getting set off that would more or less end humanity. So in January of 1966, a United States bomber collided with a tanker, because during what I already said, Chrome Dome, the aircraft would be flying around Europe, but of course they would need refueling because they only have limited fuel space. So they would make contact with the bomber, with the fuel refueling aircraft, and then would take on fuel and keep on their rounds. Now, in this particular incident, the two planes collided during the mid-air refueling, and The explosion not only killed 7 airmen, also it led to the loss of one of the 4 fusion bombs on board. This bomb was then recovered 2 months later by the US Navy. The other 3 hit land, and 2 cracked open, and today it isn't quite clear how contaminated the area still is from this incident. So as you can see, flying around with nuclear bombs all the time bears some risks for the population of countries, especially in Europe where this operation was taking place. This is one of the big cons of having your primary nuclear deterrent role with the Air Force. Another is that aircraft can be slow. We saw this quite plainly in 1961 when the Russian forces detonated the so-called Tsar bomb, which is to date the largest and most powerful nuclear explosion to be incurred by humanity. This bomb was dropped on the island, and I'm probably pronouncing this incorrectly, Novaya Zmaya, which is located north of Siberia. That's where they dropped the bomb, and they dropped it via a modified bomber to carry this enormous payload of a bomb. And with this bomb, this aircraft would have been so slow that it would have never been able to enter US airspace. Even if the air defenses were not up to the standards of today, they would have been able to shoot down this aircraft before it came anywhere close to the American shoreline. So, as we can see, this bomb was more or less just a political instrument to demonstrate Russia's power. Of course, in the interest of back then General Secretary of the Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev, who wanted to demonstrate power in front of his US foes. And at the time as well, the Russians didn't have a long-range missile, or any missile for that matter, that could carry such an immensely heavy weapon, because the Tsar bomb weighed 27 tons. And at the stance of the Soviet technology at the time, there was no way you could transport that with any missile. So as we have seen, the nuclear bomber was basically removed of its role as the main carrier of the nuclear bomb, the main deterrent from attacking a country that possesses them. However, also other legs of the current US triad are slowly coming under scrutiny, especially for their age, not for what they are. Everybody values submarines very highly, and also land-based ICBMs, and I think especially with the stealth role, the bomber will still be around. B-2 Spirit is a wonderful example of very advanced technology. It can fly for almost non-stop from a base in Alabama, I think, the nuclear strike force of the Air Force is stationed, to anywhere in Russia and can do so undetected and deliver a fatal nuclear strike. But what do I mean by coming under scrutiny? Well, especially the so-called Minutemen, the US missile systems based on land, are old, very old. Most technology is out of the 1960s when these systems were erected, and the Pentagon is currently planning to replace all three legs of the triad. It includes the submarines and also the introduction of new bomber systems, and of course the replacement of the ICBMs on land. Only problem is this comes with the gigantic price tag of $1 trillion. So those spendings are basically already booked, because as I just mentioned, the systems are slowly getting old. Also, the current Ohio class systems, the US submarines that can carry long-range missiles, are also turning quite old by now. They were built in the 1980s. So we shall see how things develop down that frontier. But for now, I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I hope you listen in again onto the History Archive. You can go check out my WhatsApp channel. I upload previews and alerts of upcoming episodes, and also got some other fun stuff planned once the channel has reached a sizable amount of subscribers. Also subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can listen to the podcasts there. You get on-screen pictures. Today I didn't have any pictures. And you don't have to go into the show notes and click onto the Google Docs links and whatnot. And of course you can also subscribe to the podcast channels on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. I think that the podcast is also available on Google Podcasts, but I don't have an exact insight on that because there are still some technical things that have to be figured out on that front. Okay, that a little word about organizational stuff. As I said, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope that you tune back in for the next episode. And for now, I hope you are going to have a wonderful week. I hope to see you in the next episode. My name is Noah.beier. Bye.